Folks, it's 7 o'clock, and so I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is the August 27th, 2019 Planning Board meeting. We're here this evening to discuss the update of the Wolfeboro Master Plan. First thing I'll do is introduce the members of the Planning Board. My name is Kathy Barnard. I'm the chairman of the Planning Board. Down at the end of the table to my left, Brad Harriman, who is the representative from the Board of Selectmen on the Planning Board. Peter Goodwin, next to Peter, John Thurston, and Mike Hodder. To my left, did I say right before? Sorry about that. Yes, right, yes, extreme right. Sorry about that. To my left is Von Dugan, who is the vice chairman of the Planning Board, and Susan Repliere. Next to Susan, Matt Sullivan, who is our Planning and Development Director, and also here is Steve Whitman, who has been working as a consultant on this project. He's from, and he's worked closely with Matt. First of all, I see a lot of the members of the various committees that sat with us as we developed this master plan. And all of these folks that, there are many of you in the audience tonight, and I just want to really say a sincere thanks to all of you. You spent a lot of time. I think we came up with a good product to bring forward to the public. So thank you, and thank you for coming to one more meeting. As you all know, the Planning Board has the responsibility to prepare the master plan, which will continue to provide guidance to our local officials about the development of our town. This plan has 8 chapters. Matt will present the plan, and at the conclusion of each chapter, I'll open the public hearing on that chapter so that you have an opportunity to comment on that particular chapter. For instance, the first chapter is housing. If you have some comments that you want to make about housing, that would be a good time to do that. Then once we've gone through all 8 chapters, and at the conclusion of the presentation, and we've had comments on each of the chapters, there'll also be another opportunity for you to make any general comments or say anything else that you feel may not have been addressed. Once we have heard all of the public comments, the Planning Board will then consider the comments. They may make some amendments, and then we will be adopting the plan. And as you folks know, that's not the end of the process at all. That's when the real work begins. And how we will be doing that is the Planning Board will appoint an implementation committee who will help guide the implementation of this plan. So I'm now going to turn this over to Matt Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks everyone for being here. We might have about equal to the number of folks who served on our committees, and about equal to the number of meetings that we actually had on this plan in the room tonight. So it was really an incredible effort by the public to put this together. I'm going to provide what I would call a 30,000-foot level review of the plan. You'll also see that when you walked in, we did have copies of the implementation chapter available of the plan. The reason that we've printed only that is that you may have seen this is a sizable document. It's 251 pages in total length. As Kathy mentioned, it is 8 chapters. There's a substantial amount of content in it, but really the meat and bones to a lot of this is the goals and recommendations that these committees ultimately recommended, and that's why we've printed that selection for you to take a look at this evening. But again, I will provide a brief review just so you have a sense of where we're going. So I'll start tonight just with what is a master plan for folks who have been to the Kickoff Forum or the Kickoff, the midterm Kickoff event. I apologize if you've heard this content before, but I just want to share that with you again so you have some context for why we're doing this long-term planning process for the town for the next 10 years. I'll talk quickly about what the 2019 plan process was, and just as a note, some of you may know we actually began this process back in 2018 in February, so we've been working on this for over a year now. So it's been, although it's a 2019 plan, it's been a multi-year effort. I'll then talk quickly about the outreach and engagement. Again, we had quite a bit of it with this plan. I think I'm really proud, perhaps most, of the fact that we had so many different folks involved with its development. So I'll talk quickly about that. I'll talk about implementation. As Kathy mentioned, after this evening or whenever this plan is ultimately adopted, that is when the real work begins. There are somewhere near 500 to 600 recommendations in the plan, all of which have a responsible party and a priority assigned to them. And we actually need to begin implementing those if we're going to succeed in achieving our long-term goals. And that work really begins with implementation. I'll talk about how we do that. I will review the vision statement that was crafted by the planning board. This vision statement was actually drafted in May of 2018 and subsequently, I don't believe, was amended by the planning board and was chosen to move forward for this public hearing. And I'll quickly review that. Then we'll jump into our public hearings. I'll do a brief presentation on each, about 2 to 4 minutes of the high-level topics and some of the recommendation themes. Hopefully you've had a chance to look through the plan before this evening. There's a lot of content in there, again, as I noted. So when you hear about these recommendations and these goals, you may not see some of the specific efforts that are going to come out of the master plan. I just want to emphasize that. But if you have questions, certainly during the public hearing process, if you have technical questions, that would be the right time to ask those. But with that, I'd just like to start with a review of what is a master plan. And to sort of frame this, the New Hampshire state statute has a definition for a master plan, but I would offer that the state statute definition says very little. And I think that when the planning board started this effort, we really started in the context of several different questions. And those were, what does our community look like today? What sorts of things are happening in the community, whether those be trends or different issues or challenges that we're facing as a community? It might be water quality, it might be economic development. What are those specific issues that we're facing and that we're seeing right now? And then looking towards the future, what trends or what potential things do we see coming in the next 10 years or beyond, or maybe way beyond, that might force us to rethink how we actually want to see our community into the future? And to do that, we actually, in some cases, develop projections of future needs. We develop population projections in some cases to determine how our community might change, to really give us a sense of how we might develop, and therefore what sorts of things we should be doing in the interim. Lastly, we come up with our vision. We want to know what do we want our community to look like in the future? And typically, we try to put that in the form of a vision statement. Again, this is where the state statute gives us a little guidance. They give us some explanation of what a vision statement should say, but really the community's vision is all up to the planning board and the folks that dedicated themselves to the process, and I'll review that with you in just a few minutes. But I think perhaps the most important question that is asked during the master planning process is how do we actually go about getting to our vision? Once we know where we want to be, what are the things that we need to take action on in order to achieve what we've set out? And that's really why we focused on this implementation work, and really I think why the implementation chapter is maybe the most important product that comes out of the plan that's created by all of those committees. As I mentioned before, we started this process back in 2018. February, we had our kickoff forum right here in the Great Hall, actually. We had about 70 participants in attendance, had a great little roundtable session as part of that. We'd initially set out for a somewhat shorter timeline for the plan, but we really got into it and felt that this needed a lot of attention. So here we are, just about a year and a half later, out in August 2019. We finally have completed our draft, and I think that that time is really evident within the plan product that was created by the planning board. So this is really how we got here. The chapters were developed by a series of subcommittees, and both at the planning board table and also in the audience we have our subcommittee chairs. But I think the chairs would agree that although they were sort of the leads in facilitating these meetings, the members really were an incredible asset to the development of the chapters. Our housing, population, and economic development work was led by Kathy Barnard and her committee. Natural resources was led by Peter Goodwin down at the end of the table. Energy by Paul O'Brien, who's in the back, who was a former planning board member. Transportation and public infrastructure were led by Brad Harriman. Arts and heritage by Vaughn Dugan. Community Facilities by John Thurston and Mike Cotter in the middle, and then Future Land Use, which was done near the end of the process, which really prescribes our future land use goals and objectives, was done again by Kathy Barnard. So those are the folks that really led the effort. But there were a lot of folks involved. There were a lot of individuals that dedicated a lot of time to this. I'll get into the numbers of what this looked like in just a few minutes. But really, I think there are thousands of hours that went into the development of these chapters. And I think it's critical to note that and thank everyone again, as Kathy did, for their participation in this process. I think that one of the big successes of the plan is that we had really a diverse group of individuals on each one of these committees that were able to give very different perspectives on a lot of the issues facing our community into the next 10-year period. I think that's maybe perhaps the biggest win, if you will, of this plan. As I was just mentioning, our kickoff forum started us off. We did have that midterm forum in order to engage with some of the folks who might only be here during the summer months. We recognize that a significant portion of Wolfeboro's population is seasonal. We have a high housing vacancy rate, and we wanted to capture as much of that population that might not be in town during the winter months as possible when we had initially had that February meeting. I mentioned before this document is about 220 pages, and while that is a lot, I think it's important to note that with those 7 planned subcommittees, the 55 subcommittee members, we had about 90 meetings, if not 100 meetings of those subcommittees. We're looking at thousands of meeting hours alone, a lot of review time of the content that went into this document, and I'd say that every member also spent countless hours outside of meetings, sending me emails and making adjustments to the chapters as they were developed. So this is a 1,000 upon 1,000 hour plan that we've put before you this evening. But what do we do with the plan should the planning board choose to move forward? And I think there are really several different prongs of this as we move forward with our implementation work. One of the first things that we'll do is actually something that was, I believe, first done, if not done before, with the 2007 plan, and that was the formation of an implementation committee. The implementation committee is a committee appointed by the planning board to actually take that implementation chapter that we have over there on that table, take it, and then actually make sure that those recommendations are brought to action. They do that a couple of different ways. They work with the responsible parties, whether they be the department heads, the different elected officials, the planning board themselves, and maybe other town staff. They actually work to make sure that those folks are held accountable, if you will, for the recommendations and goals that have been put in front of them by the planning board as part of this process. So it's the cliche, but plans should not sit on a shelf, and we really do that by assigning a committee to make sure that this plan is stewarded forward for the next 10 years and that the recommendations are actually accomplished. You may remember that at the initial kickoff forums, I had presented a bit about what are some examples of our successes over the last 10 years. And there are a tremendous number. There's been tremendous improvement in the downtown area. We've put in regulations to protect our water quality. There have been significant development of businesses within the community. We've done great things, and we hope that that work will be continued into the future. And I think the implementation committee is a critical piece of that. One other thing that we also do is, or we envision this plan will do, is it will also serve as a nice foundational piece for a lot of our existing boards and committees in the town. For those folks who don't know, we have an agricultural commission, we have an economic development committee, we have a capital improvements committee. We have countless numbers of committees that are working on a lot of the issues that we're talking about in this master plan. We drafted the master plan to complement what they're already doing on those committees, not to contradict it. But we also want the plan to serve as a nice foundational piece as they look forward to the next 10 years. What are the things that they might want to work on over that period of time? Recognizing fully that they're, in some cases, independent of the planning board, we hope that this document will serve as a guiding tool for them as they look for their own comprehensive planning into the future to achieve their goals. A few smaller items that we think will come out of this process. We also, substantial in nature, we will be updating our population chapter in 2021. I'm sure all of you have heard news stories and other information about our aging demographic and sort of this aging crisis that New Hampshire has. Our feeling is that the 2020 census will yield some interesting information that will demand that we look at our age demographics and look forward to both 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 years. And as a result, the planning board is interested in actually looking at that chapter as soon as that data those data become available. Further, one of the things that really came out of this plan was that water resources are, whether it's economic development, natural resource protection, water resources are really the common thread in Wolfeboro. And I think I remember at one of our first initial events, I made the comment that water resources are king. I think that continues to be true, and the planning board has sort of emphasized that by saying they'd like to look at developing a water resources chapter that specifically focuses on those issues We're not sure if that's going to be next year or the year after, but we know that that issue is a priority, and that's something that's come out of this plan, that's not necessarily getting enough attention within the document as it stands right now, and deserves a closer look into the future if we're going to take a very serious stance on our protection of our water resources. Two other more specific things, and I think these are critically important for tonight. I've heard some comments in advance of tonight's hearing about what the adoption of the plan means for local regulation and zoning. And the answer is that no regulations or zoning are being adopted this evening. This plan makes only recommendations about things that the planning board should look at in the future. And for that reason, when it comes to zoning and regulations, both of those are required to go through a substantial public process. For zoning, obviously, it requires a vote by the townspeople themselves. For regulations, they require public hearings and a process through the planning board. None of those things are to take place this evening. This is really just the first baby step in the direction of working on some of these things that are listed here. These are the things that the planning board is enabled to do by having a master plan, but those are steps that are taken subsequent to this process. So I think it's important to keep that out. But regardless of how you read some of what's in the plan, we're really just looking at these as goals and recommendations and not in a binding sense, so to say. Before we jump into the chapters, wanted to give a brief perspective on the vision statement. I won't, for your purposes in the audience, spend my time reading these to you this evening. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But this was the vision statement that the planning board has informally voted on to move forward on. It lines quite well with the 2007 vision statement. We looked at several resources when we were developing it. It focuses on water resources, the character of the community, but also Wolfeboro is a center for tourism that offers recreation, cultural assets, the ability to retire here, specialized healthcare, education, so really some element of economic development as well. And you might be sitting there saying, how can these things possibly coexist in one place? They have in Wolfeboro for so long, and I think the idea is to keep that into the future, certainly for the 10-year period of this plan. But this is the vision statement that the planning board has proposed for its 2019 master plan. With that, if there aren't any questions from the board, I'm going to move into the chapters. I'm going to start with the population and housing chapter. Again, for the folks in the audience, I won't read the purpose statements, but I will leave it up here for a moment and try to summarize as best as possible. The population and housing chapter did account for the fact that we need more updated population information, so we really focused on the housing component in Wolfeboro. There's an interest in having more diverse housing availability, and what they mean by that, I think, is both for different incomes and also different types, whether it be multifamily, age-restricted housing, affordable housing. Also, our waterfront homes are obviously a huge asset to the community. We need a nice mix of all of those types of housing in order to ensure that Wolfeboro is sustainable long into the future. I think we do a good job of that right now, but we want to make sure that our policies align with providing that variable type of housing into the future. There also was some significant conversation about rental housing and the lack thereof. We are hearing from some of the employers within the community that their staff are unable to find housing here and they're living in other communities. In some cases, that might be what those folks want, but there is a need for more rental housing, we believe, in the community, and that's something that the committee had identified within its work. Additionally, we want to make sure that our zoning is conducive to residential development. We want to make sure that the development is not such that it actually compromises our natural resources in any way, but we do recognize that the ability to develop is critical for the future prosperity of the community. So we want to make sure that our zoning allows for a reasonable amount of development in the context of our constraints. A couple things that we looked at in this chapter. We looked at population demographics, again, our aging population, and frankly, just the large 65-plus demographic in Wolfeboro and what that might mean for the future. We looked at school enrollment trends. There's been a lot of discussion about this over the years, about declining and stagnating enrollment in our schools due to the lack of young families in the community. We certainly did look at that and what the long-term implications might be. We looked at education and income statistics. One interesting thing is that Wolfeboro does have some perhaps surprisingly large low-income population that resides in the community that you just may not see when you're driving around, and that's something that we need to account for when we're talking about our housing types. Again, housing type is critical. We want to have a variety of housing types available. We want to make sure that housing vacancy is at a healthy level. Obviously, with our large amount of seasonal homes and summer occupancy, we have a large vacant housing stock that's year-round. With that said, I think there's a healthy balance there, and we want to make sure that we have that into the future. Housing costs, we want to have a diversity there. We want to make sure that we're providing sort of all types of housing for folks that want to be in the community. And lastly, we did a lot of review of development trends, and what I mean by that is specifically building and permit information. How have our development trends changed over the last 10-year period? And of course, when we look back at our 07 plan, it was done just as the recession was hitting. It had a very different perspective on what our building needs might be. We were very concerned about a high build rate, and although we're in a strong market right now, we obviously had a large recession in the middle there, so we have a lot of interesting development trends that have impacted the community, and we looked at that as well. The recommendations that came out are really focused on housing, again, recognizing that we need to come back to population in the future. We want to make sure that any type of housing development or redevelopment protects the character of existing neighborhoods. We don't want housing development to be incompatible with what we already have in the community because we recognize that the character is critical to the way that Wolfeboro moves forward. With that said, we want to make sure that our residential densities in a lot of our zoning districts are consistent with both our development capacity when it comes to our water and sewer capacity, and also with the neighborhood's capacity to absorb a certain level of development. We don't want to overdevelop any of our residential neighborhoods, recognizing that some might be appropriate for more dense housing development. We want to make sure that those zoning types, that zoning also allows for multiple housing types. If you know anything about our current zoning, we do have some zones where multifamily is not allowed. We just want to ensure that as we move forward that we have that zoning correct, that we're actually allowing for the right types of housing in the right zones, and that's something that the group had wanted to focus on. This is sort of a specific recommendation. We do have a conservation subdivision ordinance in the town, which is designed to protect natural resources while also allowing for a more dense type of development. But we're recognizing that ordinance isn't being used. It's not being used for the type of subdivision that we envisioned, and I think we're recognizing that there needs to be an audit to that regulation, and we're certainly recommending that be done in the near future. Further, as I just noted, we want to make sure that any development that's done is done in sort of in continuity with our water and sewer capacity. When the 07 plan was developed, and I looked to Linda Murray here, we were under a water and sewer moratorium, and certainly things have changed since that time. That said, we need to be respectful of the fact that we do have a limited capacity when we're talking about more development within the community. So continuing to make sure that those are balanced is really, really important. And then for those who don't know, we do assess impact sewer and water fees to our users. This is kind of a specific recommendation. We want to make sure that those fees are not such that they disincentivize development, that they surprise new home builders, that they're predictable, and that they actually have a reasonable methodology behind them. We want to make sure that these fees continue to give us the capital investment that we need on the town side, but also not hinder the development within the community that might actually offer great benefit to us. So that's just a brief summary of the population and housing chapter recommendations. And with that, Kathy, I'm not sure if you want to kick off the first public hearing.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, I'll open the public hearing for the housing chapter. If anyone would like to comment on it, come on up to the microphone and give us your name and your comment. Hi.
Kirk, could you turn that mic on? I'm sorry, I think it might be off. Is the switch on the top? Come on, just a second here.
Here we go. All right, we'll try that again. Good evening. Kirk Beswick, I'm representing Taylor Community. I just have two questions relative to the housing. The first one is I was listening to that. There are a lot of lofty goals there relative to workforce housing, protecting residential neighborhoods. But in the back of my mind, I was wondering, with some recent decisions and things that came before the board, how you balance expansion of the Bay Street Limited Commercial District and the other Pine Hill District, which was originally kind of zoned as a residential zone, with protecting residentially zoned areas. That was one of the things that popped into my head, because as we want to expand commercial use and tax revenue, often they encroach on residential properties, and I wondered how you balance that as a master plan item. Second question, I'll just ask the question, does Wolfeboro have a policy relative to short-term rentals as we talk about housing?
Two good questions, and I'll try to respond to these technical questions as I best can, and I may have to get back on a few of them. But the first question relative to the impacts to residential properties when it comes to commercial zoning, Wolfeboro has long sought to establish what they've labeled as transitional zones between commercial and residential zoning. These transitional zones are intended to be a lighter intensity of commercial use. And the example to which Mr. Bestwick is referring is an example of where a very intense commercial use abuts a residential use, and that can create friction when it comes to the zoning being right next to each other. So this plan specifically makes recommendations about the need to look at the transitional zones that are currently in place and ensure that they are adequately buffering our residential neighborhoods from the more intense commercial uses within the community. Hopefully that addresses part of your concern. The second question is, the town of Wolfeboro has no policy on short-term rentals. Short-term rentals are obviously a very controversial topic in the state today. I think short-term rentals are a complicated matter in the sense that they clearly can create nuisance and behavior issues in a lot of residential neighborhoods. We've certainly heard accounts of that. That said, I don't think we have an adequate understanding of the potential impacts of widespread regulation and further the impacts of the economy and the impact to taxpayers who are renting their homes, and also the economy of people spending dollars within our community. We simply do not have the data to make a decision at this point in time whether regulation is appropriate, but it's certainly something that we're aware of.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Anyone else want to make a comment about housing or anything in the housing chapter?
Is this still on? Okay. Hi, I'm Jen Morgan, and my question is regarding short-term rentals as well, specifically Airbnb and how they are rapidly taking over the rental property in Wolfeboro. I'm aware of a situation. There's an Airbnb landlord who is looking to add 10 more of those in the next year in Wolfeboro, and that takes away from our workforce. I mean, we're not going to have anybody to wait on these Airbnb tourists if our workforce can't find a place to live, especially a reasonable place to live, which we rapidly are losing.
Okay,
so I'm curious as to what the town is planning on doing to regulate Airbnb. That is a business, and it's being done in residential neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Right now, we're not doing anything to regulate, but I mean, it seems from your comment that you would support that. Is that okay? Okay, thank you.
My name is Linda Greeley. I'm in Port Wedland. I do understand that the town wants to recognize these short-term rentals as residential use. But in your statement, it says you want to protect the character of neighborhoods. Unfortunately, now in Port Wedland, we have over 7 Airbnb short-term rentals. These short-term rentals are supposed to have business licenses, pay the 9% state room and meal tax. We don't know if they do, for the simple reason their license numbers from the state are supposed to be printed in their ads, and they're not. The other problem we have in Port Wedland is most of those homes are 2-bedroom septics. Our covenants say that these homes are for single residences only. Last weekend, we had over 32 people staying in one home. The police were called numerous times. 2 weeks prior to that, we had 13 families. They parked on the street and were counted by the neighbors. A man, a woman, and 1 to 3 children stayed in this 2-bedroom septic home for 4 days. Is that still considered residential use? You say you're concerned about septics and sewers and water runoff. That is just small accounting of the unfortunate things we, the residents of Port Wedland, have had to encounter this summer. Okay. The covenants aren't being obeyed, and we also are stewards of the small waterfront on Winter Haven. So one weekend, the residents of these short-term rentals stood in the water for 4 to 6 hours drinking beer. Okay, Everybody does it. You worried about the water in Winter Harbor? There's another problem. They weren't going up to use their restrooms. So I just want you all to be aware that there is a problem with them. With the noise ordinance, our neighbors in Port Wedland this weekend were forced to listen to loud music, profanity, and everything else from noontime until 10 p.m., which is when the police said they could enforce the noise ordinance. After that, they was called numerous times until 2:30 in the morning. That doesn't make for a good quality of life in a residential neighborhood. Please consider that.
Thank you.
My name is Cindy Fournier. I'm currently residing in a building where there's 3 units. I will be residing in that building in another 2 or 3 days when I've been forced to move. They are turning my current resident that I've been in for 4 years into an Airbnb. The other 2 units in the building are already Airbnbs or short-term rentals. I don't know how they actually access them. I was asked to vacate the property as of September 1st so that they could turn my unit into a short-term rental. So I went out to try to pursue another living establishment. In a 10-week period of time, I was able to look at 2 apartments that I could afford on my semi-retired income. One of them I couldn't possibly live in. The second one I had to make a choice that that's where I'll be moving. Those were my only choices. The rest of them were priced way out of range for me to be able to even consider to afford to live in or wouldn't live in. I was promised 4 years ago when I moved into the place that I am that they were anxious to have me as a very long-term rental. But once again, once they reap the benefits of what they can make off of the short-term rentals, I became insignificant in that aspect. I think it's a growing problem in this community. I worked in the industry in this community for 11 years and I was in management, and I saw the struggles of trying to employ people in this town so that they had a place that they could afford to live in. It was a struggle that finally led the establishment that I used to work in to have J1 students come in from Russia in order to work because nobody wanted to come to this community and pay the prices for rental and work. And then once again, there was another problem in establishing a place for these J1 students to work. So there is an establishment here in Wolfeboro that has employed several J1 students this year because they could not get employees to come and work there. And I think that's a sad aspect for us to consider here in Wolfeboro, that we don't have affordable rentals for people to work. And where we could have affordable rentals, money has been the greed and taken over for these short-term rentals. They're running rampant. Someone told me today that there is close to 700 short-term rentals in Wolfeboro. And I think that's something that needs to have great attention to and some regulations put on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Matt, do you want to go on to the next?
Would you like to close this particular public hearing? Sorry.
Yes, I'll close the hearing on the housing chapter.
Okay. The next chapter is the natural resources chapter, and before I get into the purpose and the recommendations from this, I just want to note that one of the substantial guiding documents in developing this chapter was the town's existing natural resources inventory. It's a document that was done by the town several years ago, but really is a wealth of information and data and mapping as well that provided a tremendous amount of structure to what the Natural Resources Committee put together. I think Peter down at the end there would agree with that. And that's something that we want to work to update in the very near future. So as you look at the Natural Resources chapter within the current plan, please note that this is really focused on the goal and recommendation side and does not include a substantial existing conditions, but that document served in that purpose. So this is the purpose statement for the chapter. Some of the big recommendations that came out, and this is one chapter where I really have to summarize because there's a lot of detail here, but these should not strike anyone in the audience, I think, as surprising. obviously enhancing water quality and making sure that our waters are clean. And when we're talking about that, we're referring to not only drinking water, but also our recreational water, our lakes, rivers, streams, and ponds. Those are critical to the success of and health of our community, and we want to make sure that we maintain them that way. We want to make sure that we're also encouraging regional cooperation. I know that we have an Alton representative in the room this evening. We need to do more conversing with our abutters, because so much of what we're talking about when it comes to natural resources is either unfragmented land, watershed related, or related to things that are happening outside of our community. And we cannot simply sort of pull the drawbridge up and not look outside of our moat into the other communities. And I think that's something that we recognize as part of this chapter, that we need to be having more conversation with those entities. We want to enhance our forest protection efforts. We want to have more land put into permanent conservation as well. I did get a question before the meeting this evening about a specific recommendation in there that references that not all of our town-owned land is forest land is in permanent conservation easement. That's absolutely correct. We certainly do have land that is within the community owned by the town that is not in permanent conservation easement, and perhaps should be so. And I think that's something we want to work on moving forward. We do not want to maintain unfragmented lands. There are a couple ways we do that. And unfragmented lands are large areas of land that allow for wildlife passage and also create critical recreational and other spaces for the folks in our community. We want to maintain those through, again, regional conversations and making sure that our forest management plans and our conservation action plans are looking strategically at what parcels we want to protect in the community. With that said, so much of this space is used recreationally. We want to continue for that to be the case. I think one of the real opportunities for Wolfeboro that complements both our natural resources and our economic development is the opportunity for low impact recreational use of many of our open spaces. I think we have some great examples in the community of that, Sewell Woods and others. And we want to maintain that into the future. I think that as we continue to preserve more land, we want to have recreational access to it so that folks can enjoy the space and really get an appreciation for those spaces as well. Conservation land management is a critical one. We have an excellent conservation commission in the town. However, one of the things that we've realized is we don't necessarily have a concrete conservation action plan that says we'd like to look at purchasing this parcel or putting this parcel into a conservation easement. We've done that very well as opportunities have arisen over the past few years, and Wolfeboro is highly successful in that regard. But having a solid plan so that we have a predictable model for doing so, I think might be critical looking into the future, and that's something that the committee felt was important. Road corridor integrity is another item that has come up several times and in several chapters, whether it be scenic roads, class 6 roads, or even some of our other town and state roads that really provide, or scenic byways, they provide some sense of beauty and aesthetic to the community. Those are corridors that we want to protect moving forward. In some cases, that's a regulatory protection, but in other cases, it's just working with property owners to help them understand what value those corridors provide so that they can help us preserve them. Agricultural uses is something that should ring nicely with the planning board. Had a recent application for an expansion of agricultural use in front of them. We want to promote those as much as possible in the community. Great successes like the farmers market in town, I think, are an indicator that we've made great strides over the last 10 years. Anything we can do, whether it's through regulation or other, to make expansion of agricultural uses or establishment of new agricultural uses easier, I think is in the best benefit of, or is in the best interest of the community. And lastly, sort of back to what I had started with here, organizational partnerships. There are so many good organizations, whether it be Moose Mountains Regional Greenways, the Wentworth Watershed Association. So many environmental organizations exist and are doing good work in and around our community. And I think that we need to do a better job interacting and engaging with them and really leveraging each other's resources in order to achieve many of the things that are listed here. With that said, this is a brief summary of what's in natural resources. Again, this is one that has quite a bit of depth, and any specific questions or comments, we'd be happy to hear those.
Okay, so I'll open the public hearing on the natural resources, but let me just say to the public that we're sitting up here listening. Once we finish hearing from all of you, we're here because we want to hear your comments. We may not comment after you've commented, and it's not that we're not interested or aren't concerned about what you're saying, but we rest assured that we're all taking notes and that we will be discussing all these comments at a future meeting. So anyway, I just wanted to reassure for everyone of how the format is going to flow here. Okay, so anyone want to comment on the natural resources at this time?
I've tried to read the lofty goals, the numerous lofty goals. My one comment is, I saw something, and I think it was in natural resources. Now I went back to find it, and I can't. But I've had a continuous recommendation that Wolfeboro needs a water quality manager or a water commissioner to better coordinate planning, roads, Conservation Commission, and so forth. Right now we have the Cyanobacteria Committee, we have the Milfoil Committee, and all those, there aren't that many volunteers in town to continue to manufacture these committees and have them all work together effectively. So I don't think I saw that recommendation in there. I made it at one of the sessions, and I just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And it is in there. It is in there.
There is a recommendation later in the future land use chapter, I believe it is, and to that effect. Different terminology, but we'll get to that in just a few minutes.
Okay, all right, I'm going to close this public hearing, and Matt?
Okay. The economic development chapter was sort of a mix of membership from a few members from the EDC, a few members from the public, and just like our other committees. And we really, I think, this is one of the chapters that impressed me most when it came to the dialogue that we had at the meetings. Frankly, at some points it was contentious. I think it was an interesting set of meetings that we had, but the recommendations, I think, are that much more important for the community moving forward. This was really the work of some very diverse stakeholders, and I think that should be meaningful as we look forward to these recommendations. Specific action statements should be, like natural resources, of no surprise, I think, to the public. There was a sort of common thread throughout much of the master plan about developing the four-season Wolfeboro, whether that was in the context of economic development, as it is here, whether it's in the context of arts and heritage, whether it's in the context of recreation. Wolfeboro as a four-season destination really is something that clearly the community should be looking at. The specific recommendation that came out of economic development, though, was that we should really do this through a marketing and promotion effort, sort of alluding to the fact that while we are doing marketing and promotion right now, if we're really going to accomplish this objective, we need to make sure that marketing and promotion are a serious part of our strategy to do so, sort of indicating that maybe we're not doing as good a job to date. That's one thing that they had addressed. I think critical as well is that the chapter folks felt that the needs of existing businesses are really of the most critical concern. Although new businesses should be opened inside the community, we want to make sure that those new businesses are something that can be compatible and not impactful to our natural resources. We want to make sure they're going to be good stewards of our community. I think that's something that had come out of that. But again, really the needs of existing businesses, which was also part of our business retention and expansion program, I think rose to the top of this committee's priority list. Additionally, we spent an extensive amount of time looking at where in the community potential redevelopment and development might happen, as any good economic development committee should do. We went through an analysis of different development areas. We looked at different resource constraints, public infrastructure access, such as water and sewer, and tried to identify a few of these areas, and ultimately recommended that rather than identifying what those areas might be, really leaving that to the planning board through their zoning actions and regulations to determine that. But they did identify a few specific pieces that we should be looking at, and that, again, included natural resource constraints such as wetlands, steep slopes, and also those infrastructure concerns as well, and the proximity to residential neighborhoods. So really setting the stage for the planning board to look at those opportunity areas themselves with some specific criteria. That said, the committee did feel that development efforts should be largely focused on the greater downtown area. This is something that was in the 2007 plan and plans before that. And when we refer to the greater downtown area, as you've seen in the document, we're really referring to our central business district, which is our downtown core, if you will. The Wolfeboro Falls Limited Business District, which is over sort of in the Center Street, Clark Plaza area, out to the Pine Street split. And then lastly, the Bay Street area, the Bay Street Limited Business District, which is pretty self-explanatory, runs along Bay Street out towards the Taylor community in that area. Those are existing commercial zoning areas, and we really view those as the prime redevelopment and development opportunity areas. They currently are home to a lot of commercial development, but there's available capacity there, and that's really where development should be focused. Lastly, or second to last, the committee did build on recent conversations about hospitality and the need for additional lodging facilities within the community. Certainly there's an interest in expanding hospitality and even looking at a conference center or some other offering. There isn't really a specific strategy as to how to do this, but I think it's something that we all recognize is critical to the community. And tying it back to a prior conversation about Airbnb, if eventually the community were to pursue something of that nature, we'd have to ultimately offer, hopefully, more lodging so that folks could come enjoy the community. So I think this is something that may be related to that in a way. And lastly, one thing I want to touch on that I think was also noted in several chapters is that we need to improve our partnerships as the town, and that includes town bodies as well. We are home to a lot of large institutions, Brewster Academy, Huggins Hospital, including others. We want to make sure that we are good partners with them and that we're regularly engaged in conversations. I think too often we tend to worry about what the others are thinking, and I think a more collaborative environment would produce better results for the community. So this is something that came up during our conversations, and particularly because a lot of those folks were actually in the room to make these points, I think, that we could always improve our partnerships, and that's something we like to focus on for the next 10-year period when it comes to economic development. I'd like to just note quickly, though, that the general ideas of workforce development, workforce retention were certainly discussed at the committee. Those are larger statewide issues. But if I can speak sort of for the committee, those were recognized as things that the planning board might not play a direct role in changing, and it really would be through these partnerships and understanding what the needs are of those folks out in the community that we could effectuate change, not on the regulatory side of things. So with that, that's a summary of that chapter.
Okay, so I will open the public hearing on economic development chapter. Anyone wants to comment on it, come on up.
Jerome Holden from Grove Street. Focusing development only in the downtown central business area is very limiting. I think we need to do that on the Route 28 area and also the 109A area out by Winnipesaukee Lumber and out in that area. Shouldn't just be pigeonholed into those 3 little spots. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, it's Kirk Beswick from Taylor Community again. I want to apologize because during the housing session, after I spoke, I went back and in the full, I printed the full report, which my printer didn't like all that much, but on page 156, you did address short-term rentals as a recommendation, so I apologize for bringing that up. I hadn't caught that when I first reviewed this, so it is something that was recommended here. And also, under the housing recommendations number 6, you supported the construction of continuing care retirement communities, which I want to express on behalf of Taylor, that we appreciate that because going forward we have found a good need for that here. Under economic development, I want to just express, because in your recommendations here, filter bed, which is on the other side of Bay Street, obviously was the subject of a lot of conversation earlier in the year. There was a warrant article for a rezoning of that area. And I guess on behalf of our folks and abutters, I just want to express our interest in discussing that further, because obviously there's a great need for access to certain types of businesses. There's only so much room to grow. But on behalf of Taylor, we have some interest in that based on our future growth potential. But also we want to ensure that whatever is done back there is done with real thoughtfulness relative to the residential neighborhood back there, relative to our neighborhood, and potentially even the thought process of creating a new zoning designation that would address a lighter type commercial in keeping with the downtown area and also with a retirement community and also the existing residential properties that are already back there. So I want to express I'm thankful that you guys spent a lot of time on this. It actually shows up as a real thoughtful recommendation. And I just want to ask that as that moves forward, that you all select or ask for a lot of input on that, because I think that's going to be a very interesting discussion. There's a lot of interesting parties in this discussion. So Taylor is offering to participate in that to whatever extent that is necessary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Suzanne Ryan, just a question relevant to the hospitality. I know that you had a public hearing with stakeholders and the public on expanding the number of hotel motel units, and also through that discussion came up about a conference center. Can you tell me sort of where that all sits or fits? And to what scale, and keeping in mind that the Allen A, which is now the Lake Wentworth, is in full swing with a lot more rooms to offer, so I'm wondering how all that's shaken out.
Yeah, basically this chapter will be turned over to the Economic Development Committee for initial discussions. And so that's where they would start, and any discussions about scale and things of that nature would occur there. If they.
What happened with the idea of moving forward with expansion of hotel motel rooms? Did that just, what did happen to it?
So ultimately, the planning board decided not to move forward with that zoning amendment, Suzanne. After that public forum back in 2017, I believe.
April 25, 17.
17. The planning board decided not to move forward with an amendment to zoning at that time. Certainly the addition of the Lake Wentworth Inn does add capacity and changes some of the numbers in the study that was produced. But that said, I think that new visitor numbers may also change our perspective on the need for lodging in the community. But I think that ultimately the EDC may choose to push further on this issue, maybe push further with the planning board, but the conversation certainly is not over.
If I may, there is an intermediary step between this public hearing and this document going to EDC for implementation, and that is the planning board's discussion of the master plan and the recommendations in it in its entirety. This chapter will be looked at along with every other chapter, and this recommendation will be looked at along with every other recommendation by members of the planning board. We are responsible for issuing the document, and consequently will be responsible for each individual recommendation. I'll just point out that in April of 17, we held a lodging forum here, inviting every owner or hotelier in town to come here. We held a round table. We listened to what they had to say. We heard nothing. Many of the people currently engaged in this business, that it would indicate that they were in favor of a large hotel or lifting the 50-bed limit currently in zoning on a new hotel. The planning board subsequently debated the issue, listened to their input, and we voted unanimously in November of that year not to raise the limit, I beg your pardon, of 50 beds. So as far as the planning board is concerned, we have had a vote. We have listened to the individuals involved in the business. We have input. We're going to be looking at this recommendation closely when we come to consider this chapter.
Okay, thank you. Any other member of the public? Okay, then I'll close the public hearing on economic development. Okay. Matt.
Community facilities chapter, if folks haven't had an opportunity to view the plan, I just want to sort of commend this group on the amazing job that they did on what they have called strictly their Community Facilities Gazetteer, which is a lovely little document. I really do encourage you to take a look at it, that summarizes the different community facilities or town-owned facilities, and also some of the needs and asset inventories that exist within those. And I think it's something that we didn't really expect from the committee when they first started, but it's something that really drove their recommendations that I'll get to in just a second. And I think they spent a lot of thoughtful time on coming up with that. Their vision is a pretty simple one, but I think it's dead on. You can see it here. Obviously, we want to have well-maintained facilities that provide a high level of service for the taxpayers. And there are a couple different ways that they've set out to do that. And I've broken them really into two categories, I think, as they did. And that is, we want to plan for the maintenance and upkeep of our existing facilities, one of which we're sitting in right now, the town hall that was redone several years ago, and also to plan for new and expanded facilities. Those of you who might know, we're talking about a couple different expansion and renovation projects in town over the next few years, and even out into the future a bit more. And really, those are the two primary goals. But when it comes to plans for existing maintenance or existing facilities, we want to use capital reserve funding. Those of you who have voted in town have seen the capital reserves on the warrant article. Capital reserves allow us to be proactive about putting away money to ensure that our assets can be maintained adequately into the future. They're more flexible in the sense that we can put together a clear plan so that the voters find them predictable, but also give us spending flexibility so that we can be ready with money when emergencies do arise. And that's how we've really looked at capital reserves when it comes to our facility maintenance, and we want to continue to use those into the future. The basis of that, though, really is having a clearly developed asset management plan. Asset management plans are sort of at their most basic level an inventory of what exists within a facility, but also a long-term schedule for replacement and upkeep that goes into that. And the idea there, again, is to create a predictable funding need and need for staff as well for how to make sure that a facility continues to operate in the future. For example, when you invest in a building like this, rather than coming back in 10 years to do large-scale replacement or renovation, we can do smaller maintenance that will limit the impact to the taxpayers long-term. One of the ways we do that is this sort of tandem approach with asset management planning and capital reserve planning, something the community has done very, very well that we'd like to continue into the future. One item that was brought up, I think, is that generally facilities do need some help beyond the departments that are maintaining them. And one of the ways that was suggested to do that is actually to look at some maintenance support, whether that be through staffing or other entities. There is a need to bring expertise to the town when it comes to maintaining the buildings. Certainly not intended to be a sad story, but we lack the expertise sometimes when it comes to maintaining our buildings, and I think sometimes that shows, and we'd like to improve that into the future. When it comes to our new and expanded facilities, I'll go quickly through these. Some of them you may have heard. We have a public safety facility that may be coming up in the next few years. It's planned for 2022 in our current CIP, an upgrade to the police and fire station. Additionally, we have a municipal electric generation building that sits vacant right down on Laner Street that presents a potential opportunity. We're not sure what exactly we're going to move forward with doing with that building, but it is a site right in the downtown core area and could be potentially redeveloped if we're able to find out what a viable use might be there. So it's a real opportunity for us. Additionally, this community center line is both a need, I think, in the sense that there is an interest in having a community center created in the community, and also the fact that we have an existing community center right adjacent to that municipal electric building that is in need of some TLC. And we certainly want to look at what the long-term plan is for that building. The dockside docks are needed some repairs. Also an expansion is being considered. So we're looking at what the best way is to prioritize funding for that, but certainly that's a capital investment that I think we all recognize the need for in the coming years. Pop Whalen Arena is a wonderful asset, much like Abenaki in the community. It's something I think that makes Wolfeboro unique in a lot of senses and also gives us the ability to attract young families, not just to visit, but potentially to live here. But we want to make sure that that gift that was given to the town is maintained long into the future. I think we need to make sure there's a sustainable funding model for it. I think the Community Facilities Group looked at that in some level of detail. Lastly, our Libby Museum is a wonderful asset to the community. It's another unique feature of Wolfeboro. We want to make sure that they're able to stay in their current home and certainly maintain the existing exhibits that they have in that facility. And you'll potentially see some more information coming about that soon. Our beaches have been a new issue in some senses, or at least for me, have been a newer issue this year. Wolfeboro is becoming increasingly popular. For those of you who've been to our beaches over the weekends, particularly this year, We are seeing increased traffic at the beaches. We also are seeing an increased need for ADA access at some of the beaches. We're recognizing that we have a capacity issue that we need to address, and we don't have specific recommendations about how to do that, but it has not gone without being noticed. Certainly town elected officials and staff are looking at the fact that our beaches need to address potential capacity issues. And lastly, I think that one of the ways overarching that we approach all of these needs that the community has, and one thing that Wolfeboro has done perhaps better than any other community in the state of New Hampshire, is pursuing these different opportunities and needs through public-private partnerships. We can look at so many, the town hall that we're in right now, the library facility, the Abenaki Ski Lodge. I'm missing some, I know, but those are really excellent examples of the willingness of residents to privately contribute to the long-term vitality and beautification of their community. I think the more that we can use that tool to have wins for both the residents and the town, if you will, and the visitors and guests that come here, I think the more successful we'll be as a community. So we want to make sure we use that public-private partnership model long into the future as we have to date. And then lastly, I just wanted to emphasize again the Community Facilities Gazetteer is a very nice document that you should take a look at. That's all I have to add.
Okay, I'll open the public hearing on the Community Facilities chapter. If anyone wants to comment on that chapter. Okay, then I'll close the public hearing and go back to Matt.
Okay. Thought I would get more breaks tonight, but apparently not. Let's see. Let's move on to arts, culture, and heritage. This is the first of our new chapters for the 2019 plan, and I'll rely on Vaughn maybe a bit to remind me how this came about, but I think it was in our original structure that we'd like to have some sort of arts and heritage or arts and historic resources chapter in this time, recognizing really that Wolfeboro is unique. We just referenced the Libby Museum. We have the Clark Complex, obviously. We have a tremendous amount of historic structures and resources and cultural assets in the community. And there's a real need to not only identify those, but also ensure that for the long-term period they're protected as well, because I think their value to the community is almost immeasurable. So this committee set out to really look at that and also look more broadly at what the impact is of arts and culture in the community. And this is a really challenging thing to do. It's hard to put dollars around. We have a lot of events in the community. We have a lot of concerts. We have a lot of organizations and nonprofits that are operating. But we actually tried to do that. And I think what we found is that arts and culture has a massive impact on our community. It's something that's a real opportunity for us as we move forward as well. So some specific actions that were identified. There, as I just mentioned, are a lot of activities and programs within the town. There's a varying level of how that information and a varying type of mediums that information is shared on. The goal is really to make that information more easily accessible. One example of that, and I think this is just one of many, is the potential to have a consolidated events calendar. Right now we have several organizations in the community that are publishing their own unique events calendars. Some are aggregated to include the events of other organizations, but we're really missing sort of a central calendar for the community that includes public events, private events, all types of events that you may be interested in as residents and also that our guests to the community might be interested in. That's something that we could potentially easily do with our existing town website and something that came out of this chapter. Additionally, on the asset side of things, we do want to have the ability to map and inventory our historic assets, and there have been several sort of independent efforts over the years, whether it's in the 1980 master plan, the 1996 master plan, or even the 07 master plan. There were several disparate resources that documented where historical resources existed in the community, but no consolidated document or plan has ever been developed. And that's something that I know that the Heritage Committee is interested in doing, and something that this chapter identifies as a high priority. In order to protect these resources, the first thing we have to do is know where they are and what their value is, and we simply do not have that information readily available to us. That said, the Historical Society has done a tremendous amount of work on this over the years. They have Jean Deneau and the folks over there have done a wonderful job creating maps and different documents that include these things, and we want to work to support them and work with them to potentially create this resource document that identifies what our historical and cultural resources are. Critical to this, I think, also is the preservation and encouraging the protection of a lot of our historic character. I refer specifically here to buildings, but I think there was a more general conversation as part of the Arts, Culture, and Heritage chapter. We want to be able to do this a couple different ways, whether it's building codes that incentivize the development of or redevelopment of existing historic structures, whether it's incentive programs such as the Barn Preservation Easement Program under 79D. There are things that we could be doing as a community to actually make it easier for folks who want to go into a project and rehabilitate an existing historic structure that much easier. And we're not necessarily doing all that we could right now. So that's a huge priority that came out of this chapter. One other thing I should mention here is that the ability to educate town officials about where waivers to building codes might be appropriate is something that was specifically focused on. I think that's a big opportunity for our staff to get a little more comfortable with those things. This 4-season item popped up again, the need to offer for all seasons of the year, cultural and recreational and arts programs. One of the things that we see as the town's role in that is that we have wonderful spaces like this great hall right here. And anything that we can do to increase the use reasonably within our town spaces, I think, is something, a little piece that we can do to facilitate the increase of the arts within the community. Also, if we can, wherever possible, work with organizations to really encourage shared promotion of events and collaboration on marketing opportunities. Again, this goes back to the fact that we have so many entities within the community that are often sort of working in their own space. The more that we can do to bring those groups together, even as just a facilitator, we believe that they'll reach a larger audience in the community. And that's something that this group spent a lot of time talking about, particularly when they were looking at just the sheer number of organizations and venues that exist in our community and the fact that there are so many opportunities for partnership there. So I think that's a big one coming out of this, just to, again, the need for collaboration. Engagement with the youth, really when it comes to, I think, not just arts as I wrote here, but also just educating about the importance of some of our historic resources in the community. This was emphasized in the goals and recommendations. There's also a sense that there could be feeder programs and potentially even scholarship opportunities for folks who are interested in pursuing careers or at least education in the arts and historic preservation. That's something that this group would like to look at. What the town's role is, I think we need to figure that out, but I think it's a huge opportunity for the community. Then getting down to a little more the hardscape, if you will, more the land use planning side, supporting as much as possible the enhancement of our gateway areas and our downtown areas. And one of the big ways they wanted to do that is really focusing on the aesthetic and looking at trees and street beautification. So much of Wolfeboro's character, I think, is defined not just by its rural spaces and its beautiful natural resources, but also about the quaint village character that we have. And anything we can do to enhance that, I think, is critical. And certainly this committee recognized that as a high priority.
All right, I'll open the public hearing for arts, culture, and heritage.
My name is Paul Vivian from Post 18 of the American Legion. Along these same lines, we are starting a campaign to renovate our building, which is on the historical list. Built in 1860. It's about to collapse, quite honestly. It's in very sad shape, but we want to renovate it, keep its historical character, and return value once again to Wolfeboro, where it can be used not just for Legionnaires telling lies and war stories, but also so that we can provide a low-cost venue for various groups in town, which is what we had done historically since 1927, and we want to do that. And we also want to be able to provide, if God forbid there should be an emergency, a relief shelter for citizens of the area. And we hope that this will enhance the historic efforts and preservation efforts of the town.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'll close this public hearing and go back to Matt.
Transportation and infrastructure was one of our final chapters to wrap up, and I think part of that is just the sheer scope of this. This is one of the chapters that I think is most relatable to the duties of the planning board and certainly to the Board of Selectmen. There's a lot of content in here, and you'll see that I think this chapter has by itself about 200 recommendations or so. There's quite a bit of effort put into this chapter, as were the others. To summarize, I've actually have 2 slides here because I think the chapter is so big in scope. Focusing first on the transportation side of things, we obviously have an annual road upgrade program. We have our New Hampshire Route 28 improvement program scheduled for 2024. We also have the Center Street project, which is beautiful at this time, but as we all know, was relatively painful over the past few years. But transportation access is a critical piece of our community, and maintaining it is highly important, and also making sure that it's safe is an important asset. So we want to make sure that when we look forward, we're addressing roadway deficiencies, and these are really areas where we have conflicts between not just vehicle on vehicle, but also vehicle on pedestrian, vehicle on bicycle, vehicle upon anything. We want to make sure that our roadways are safe for all modes of travel, and that's something that was in the 2007 master plan that we actually just took right out and pulled into this, because that recommendation has not lost its sense of time. It's still relevant to our conversation today. Those of you who may know, we are having conversations with the state of New Hampshire, may have attended our recent public forum to talk about rumble strips and crosswalks. This is certainly something that this goal touches on, making sure that our deficiencies are remedied. Additionally, we want to make sure that we're able to provide access for pedestrians, bicyclists, and other modes of transportation into our downtown area. We recognize that bicycle and pedestrian access may not be realistic in some of the more rural portions of the community, but really being able to connect people who are either staying in the downtown or want to come to the downtown and access the Cotton Valley Rail Trail, or even some of the businesses in the downtown or the dockside area. We want to ensure that there's safe passages and connectivity between where their destination is and where they start their journey. And that's something that, again, was in the 2007 plan that still applies today. We want to also minimize traffic impacts of new development. This refers to both your typical residential sort of subdivision or other development, and also commercial development. We want to carefully look at the impacts of any new or redevelopment projects when they're coming into the community to make sure that we don't create an undue traffic burden on any specific area. One example, I think, to sort of put some context to this is some of the conversation we had about the Filter Bed Road rezoning last year. There were concerns about traffic impacts. That's always something that's on I think the planning board's mind when it's looking at a redevelopment application, or certainly a rezoning effort. It's something that the master plan prescribes as well. There are a few examples where new connections might be possible. One of these is the Railroad Ave extension that's already been reviewed by the voters. That's an example where it's logical for us to complete the connection there, really bringing 2 points of destination together. Another that is in the plan is the Filter Bed Road viability. Obviously, the potential to lay that road out into the future is a long-term project. And there are others as well that are identified and certainly were discussed as part of this. But we really want to always be sort of auditing our road network and our pedestrian network to review where new connections might be necessary. And we really do that by looking at where are people likely to drive or walk, and that's something that the planning board has done historically and will continue to do. Moving to the water and sewer side of things, we want to make sure that our wastewater disposal system is in compliance with our state administrative order of consent. That's obviously something that has changed substantially since the 2007 plan was done. We were under that moratorium program. We've made significant investment there, and there's more investment in permitting to be done. But certainly we want to make sure that our effluent disposal system is capable of disposing of whatever capacity or whatever demand we put on it through any new or redevelopment activity that is done, and even the existing development that exists within the community. Clean and safe water, this goes without saying. When it comes to our water system, we not only need to make sure that our water system is functioning efficiently, we also need to make sure that we're compliant with our state and federal regulations, and that we're providing clean water to the homes. I would also note that one thing that is touched on in this plan that isn't specifically referenced here is that we recognize that a significant portion of the residents in our town are on septic and well systems, and we have discussed the potential to look at more stringent standards on those systems as well, because we recognize that this, when we're referring to users, it's a very small portion of the population, and I'm glad we have Rick Skarinka here from DES who works on these issues regularly. Certainly we hope we can make some progress here and potentially look at some different standards for our community. One new issue that's arisen through this master plan is the presence of seasonal and private water lines. We have several situations in the town where we have above ground and below ground seasonal water lines and also private water lines with unclear ownership. And we're concerned about the long-term viability and, again, going back to asset management planning, the long-term maintenance of that infrastructure that's in place with unclear responsibility. We as a town, though we might not be the responsible party, want to work with the folks who might be or are to make sure those assets are maintained so that folks have adequate connection to water, clean water into the future. And lastly, for all of our ratepayers and sewer payers out there, we want to make sure that that we're monitoring our rates to ensure that we're putting enough money away for long-term capital investment, but also making sure that the fees are equitable and predictable for the users that are on them. We certainly want to do that long-term, and we do that regularly as it is today. New to this chapter for this iteration, just a few items. We did include some references to hazard mitigation and emergency operations planning. Those are two efforts that recently the town has gone through to update those two plans. Those updates are critical for different grant funding that might be available, and also to make sure that we have infrastructure plans in place should an emergency happen. This really lays that out, and making sure that those plans are updated to our current infrastructure is something we need to do into the future. And lastly, we talked about these different new sets of infrastructure that weren't really considered in the 2007 plan. That includes that list here, and this is really our docks, our boat ramps, our sidewalks, which were a bit in the 2007 plan, our parking lots, and I did repeat sidewalks there, I apologize, our stormwater system, and our streets and right-of-ways. These are pieces of infrastructure that I think are often forgotten, perhaps not by town staff, but certainly by maybe the planning board and certainly by members of the public. These are things that we need to be investing money in regularly. And I think that there's a real recognition of that now as we're putting together our asset management plans for these different things. But we need to make sure that we begin to consider them as critical pieces of infrastructure, much in the same way that we do with our water, sewer, and transportation networks. So in doing so, we need to develop these asset management plans to ensure that infrastructure is taken care of for the long term. That's all I have on infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll open the public hearing for the transportation and infrastructure chapter. Anyone wants to make any comments?
Hello, my name is Rhonda Alden, and I wanted to make comment in particular about in this section, what was mentioned about the extension of Filterbed Road between Varney Road and Pine Hill Road. What I'd like to comment on is the conflict that even resides in this one document, because earlier under natural resources, you speak of protecting large tracts of land, recreational space, and that extension of Filterbed Road through to Pine Hill Road would in fact cut through a large parcel of land, I believe owned by the Wolfeboro Land Bank, that their target goal is protection of recreation space for that, or that's always been a big part of their focus. And then in addition to that, the further conflict I find is in reference back to the ballot item that was on the town vote back in March relative to Pine Hill Road Development District. The final vote on that was pretty much a 3-to-1 against that effort, which shows that the community is not looking to cut through that area and doesn't want that sort of expansion in that area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Jim Knupp. I just wanted to comment on the pedestrian and bicycle aspect of this plan. You'll notice that that's also touched upon in the energy chapter to a degree. I noticed that it's only listed as medium priority in the transportation section. In the energy chapter, where we talk about limiting the downtown area for special events to foot traffic only as a high priority, I think in the future the transportation and energy committees are probably going to work together on this. That should, in my estimation, be a very high priority for this town. Bicycle safety, both for kids going to school and for people transiting the downtown area, should be an essential part of how we look at our future planning for town. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ted Morgan. I live on Filterbed Road, and I just wanted to say I would be disappointed if you did cut that road the mile down to 109A, because my wife and I picked it. We liked the quiet nature of it. It would also almost certainly need to be widened, and we would be disappointed. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen.
Thank you. Okay. Okay.
I'm Beth Kreinchich, and I live on Friend Street. So with the filter bed road going through, I'm going to assume that they're turning onto Friend Street. Am I right with that? Straight shot through? Correct.
Could be, yes.
Okay. And you talked about minimizing traffic, impacts of new development. The traffic on our road now is tractor trailers, just lots of traffic now because everybody's cutting through. If you put businesses down there, just turning a tractor trailer up at the top of our road is kind of a dangerous thing to begin with. And when they come down our road, because I believe our road is like maybe 12%, it's pretty steep, they have to put their brakes on. There's lots of noise. And I'm wondering if even our road is wide enough to support that traffic, and how it would impact us as far as our taxes go, having all that traffic come down through and just impact the whole area all around.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see anyone else, then I'll close the public hearing for transportation and infrastructure.
Okay.
And on to energy.
Energy chapter. This is another new chapter for the 2019 plan. This was born out of the Energy Committee's attendance of an initial planning board planning session for the master plan. Susan Fuller, I believe, spoke to add this chapter in, and I think it's one of the great successes of this plan, and sets some really lofty goals for the community into the future. And I think it's really an interesting one if you do have a chance to read it in detail. I won't read the purpose statement, but I'd like to jump straight into the goals and recommendations here, summarizing with just these two very specific ones that I think are quite interesting. The first being reduction of the overall town government energy usage by 40% in the next 10-year period. An extremely progressive goal that we will have to look closely at as a town. Look at a variety of strategies to actually achieve that. Again, I think this is an excellent example of a recommendation that isn't necessarily binding for the town, but sets a clear priority for what we need to look at, certainly internally for our energy usage. And moving to the next, achieving a town-wide goal of 50% renewable sources of electricity by 2029, that same 10-year period, comparably is not something that will we're not bound to, but it's something that we should look at as a community if we are really trying to move towards more renewable sources of energy. This is a goal that has been set within this chapter. That said, there's also some good attention paid to the municipal electric department. Barry Muccio was an active participant in many of the discussions in this chapter. I think I can say he was sometimes outside of his comfort zone, but we really had some great progressive discussions about these goals and really was supportive in the end and worked really well with this group. And he's interested, and I think the group is also interested, in providing a 10-year plan for the municipal electric department to ensure that it stays sustainable long into the future. Really to make sure that we keep current with new technology. Obviously, the technology around energy is changing rapidly in the same way that technology around our cell phones and computers has changed over the last 10 to 20 years. And the municipal electric department needs to ensure that for its ratepayers, it's staying up to date with those technological changes, as well as the technological changes surrounding energy supply and demand. Now, we've heard lots of news about the offlining of nuclear power plants and other things. We want to make sure that our energy strategy is a sustainable one long into the future. An internal goal and recommendation that was sort of interesting that came out of this is that the town should really look closely, and as part of its annual report that I hope you all pick up a copy of, publish publicly information about how our energy usage has changed year over year. And I think that should be done comprehensively across all of our town accounts. Really with an eye towards this first goal that's listed here of energy reduction, but really introducing a level of accountability with our departments that they are going to try to reduce energy if possible. And I think that this energy tracking and the publishing of this data would be an important step towards doing that. It's something that we've dabbled in the past as a town, but really dedicating our town staff to it, I think, is critical and something that's being recommended here. Tying directly back into land use, there are certain land use development types that can decrease energy usage, and the group did discuss those, and that's really redevelopment in existing developed areas. And also, the reason to do that is that the more access that folks have to services and goods in their close proximity, really in a more densely developed area, the less likely they are to burn fuel and use other energy that might be necessary for long vehicle trips. Recognizing fully that not all the folks in town want to live in the downtown core of the downtown area, but where possible, citing redevelopment and development in those areas in an effort to reduce energy usage. Lastly, and I think this is really the all tying together goal that was produced from this chapter, is that in order to accomplish any of the precedent 5 goals that I've just listed, education is going to be critical. Educating folks not only on why energy reduction is important, but also on why that might actually be important good for their pocketbook as well into the long-term future. Certainly investments in solar are one thing that was discussed at this committee, but there are other alternative energies that are possible for implementation as well. But really educating folks about why that investment might be important is a critical piece that the town needs to take an active leadership role in, and something that we haven't historically done that we may be able to do into the future.
Okay, I'll open the public hearing for the energy chapter.
Hi, Craig Gemmel from Brewster Academy. Thank you, Planning Board and Matt, and your leadership, and everyone in the room who's been involved in this process. It's been very interesting. I've got 2 comments, one very general and one very specific. The general is that Brewster's history and Wolfeboro's history are very closely intertwined and certainly mutually informing. And I smiled as I read the master plan and the action items, because a lot of the language that's being used at Brewster about our future is very strongly reflected in the work that's been done by the town and by its residents. So I'm really happy to be a member of this town. The specific comment is that I want to reiterate what Matt had to say about the virtues of these very forward-looking energy goals. We are not embedded in a vacuum. We don't have a drawbridge. We are not surrounded by a moat. We are part of the broader world, and certainly philosophically it makes sense for us to think about what our contribution to the broader world's future is, but economically it also makes a tremendous amount of sense. So I wanted to piggyback on your comments there, Matt. So thank you again.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
My name is Vlado Krajncic. I find it odd that that energy thing didn't use the word solar in any way, form. It's my understanding that the town and the electric department are going to be reducing incentives for people to convert to solar. I don't have any written data or anything. In conversation with people who I trust in town work have given me this information, and I've heard it through other sources. I find it odd that solar is not there. The town, it sounds like to me, is going to be discouraging solar use or solar expansion. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'll close the public hearing on the energy chapter and go on to future land use.
The future land use chapter represents really a mix of all of the chapters combined, I think. This committee convened at the end of the process in 2019, looked comprehensively at all of the existing draft chapters before convening, looked to develop what they felt the broad themes were within the community from those chapters that were developed, and then subsequently developed recommendations to meet those themes. Future land use is not just to look at what our future land uses should be. It really represents probably the most direct tie to what the planning board's regulatory and zoning actions might be after this planning document is completed. That said, it's only one piece of 8, as we've covered tonight. But this chapter really has more substantive recommendations than some of the others in some ways. I just want to point that out. That said, I want to summarize what the broad categories were that were included herein. I hesitate because I'm not sure I'm doing this chapter justice by doing this, but these are really the broad themes that were identified within this. And I think you'll see almost immediately that these align to the chapters that I've covered precedent to this evening. The first certainly being water quality protection. Within water quality protection, there were several subcategories that were identified, several really strategy approaches that should be taken, and several sort of actual topic areas. And those included water quality, stormwater runoff, and actual regulatory recommendations. So there are subcategories below that water quality protection goal. But water quality protection, as I've mentioned, I think several times this evening, is really critical to the long-term success of the community. Aligning quite well with the natural resources chapter, open space protection and the relationship it has both with recreational economic development, water quality protection, and particularly just land conservation priorities was also rose to the top. And that really came largely out of the natural resources chapter, but certainly was interwoven into others as well. And that's a massive priority here. Community character is a bit of a fuzzier category area. What exactly does that mean? Obviously, I think everybody has their own perception of what Wolfeboro's community character is. But whatever it is, it's drawn all of you to this community for one reason or another. We have a community that we look out and see, and we want to maintain that community as much as possible while still allowing for a reasonable amount of growth and development. Within community character, we provide a few different sections here as well, whether it be regulatory, programmatic, or historic. Those were the 3 subsets that were created within community character, but taking different approaches to ensuring that that's maintained into the future. Housing, again, was noted as a priority, and particularly the need for more diverse housing opportunity, diverse housing types, diverse housing values. That's a long-term priority. I think the Airbnb and short-term rental conversation plays well into that. We need to provide diversity and not exclude certain housing opportunities, and that's something that this chapter touched on again. And this chapter did discuss some different varying levels of density review as well. Economic development. This was really an affirmation, I think, of the goals contained within the economic development chapter, recognizing, again, that future commercial development should be done, or redevelopment should be done in areas that make sense. And what makes sense is typically those that are not constrained by resources, and also those that have infrastructure access. Those are really the priority areas for any type of economic development that should be done. But certainly there are some other areas mentioned here, including Pine Hill Road, the business park that currently exists, and discussion of transitional zones. To my earlier comment earlier this evening, the need to review those transitional zones and make sure that they actually reflect the uses that are appropriate in those different areas between our more intense commercial and residential zones. Redevelopment opportunities. This almost fits quite well, or it almost could be a subset of economic development. Redevelopment opportunities we believe to be our biggest economic development opportunity. This is really looking at our existing areas, whether it be the Wolfeboro Falls area, the Laner, Glendon, School Street, Railroad Station area downtown, the Bay Street area, and then any sections of the greater downtown loop that might ultimately be adjusted into zoning in the future. Looking really at those as our target areas for where development will happen because they make logical sense. That's been really prioritized within this. Gateway enhancement, getting back to one of the comments I've made during the natural resources chapter, our transportation corridors, whether they be, again, our Class 6 roads, our scenic roads, Route 28 coming into the community, all of those types of corridors, I think, represent some sort of gateway for some mode, whether it be a bicycle, a pedestrian, a vehicle. Making sure that they introduce the person coming into Wolfeboro to a beautiful community and the community that we'd like to present, I think is important moving forward. We certainly don't want to damage those corridors by allowing the wrong type of development, and we need to make sure that our zoning reflects that moving forward. Lastly, on transportation, we do have some major transportation projects coming up, but I'd point out that many of those transportation projects, Route 28 being a good example of which, really have a land use and an aesthetic tie. The development of those transportation corridors directly impacts the way that folks view our community. And if we don't do that the right way, we can very quickly end up with the wrong development. So I think that dedicating funding and investment into our transportation infrastructure upgrade and development is critical moving forward to the way that our community appears to the public. That is the last I have. there.
Okay, open the public hearing for the future land use chapter.
Hi, I'm Chuck Mansfield, and first off, I'd like to say
Thank you.
this is amazing that you guys take the time and you're trying to be cohesive and make a good plan. That's what is always needed to move forward and make things beautiful. I just want to address a couple points on this paragraph. It's the consider extending Filter Bed Road from wastewater treatment up to 109A, and also the creation of the new transitional Pine Hill Road, Filter Bed Road, and Bay Street. A big chunk of these people are here with me with the same kind of concerns, and I just thought you guys should know, some of my neighbors. 2 points, really. I guess the first one is mine. I live at the corner of Varney Road, Filter Bed, and Friend, a little house right on the corner. So the character of my property would be extremely affected. Just the character. I'm not talking about the value. It's not about the value. It's about the character. That would become a major thoroughfare, as we all know, if you take it all the way through to 109. And this other woman said who lives on Friend Street, coming down. You would all be concerned too if you lived in that little house on that corner and were considering making Filter Bed a major thoroughfare. It's totally going to change the character of everything. The other is, of course, there's a lot of talking points. Meredith was kind enough, about traffic and the heavy trucks. The fact that Abenaki Trail comes out there. People walk. I sit there on my deck, tired. I sit there and I see people. They walk down that road. They ride their bikes down that road. Taylor community has a rear entrance out onto Filter Bed Road. Elderly people, people over 55, walk that road to go downtown because Bay Street is kind of hairy, to walk to get to downtown. So there's that. There's electrical trucks going to the transfer station, big electric trucks. There are 18-wheelers going to the water treatment plant. There's a lot going on that little bit of road, and to take it all the way through to 109A is going to make a big impact and could be dangerous, number one. And then I don't even know how much would something like that cost. It would be millions and millions of dollars. Where would that money? The second point is about the Pine Hill Road Development District. Didn't they have a meeting, a warrant article, where the ballot was to rezone the residential properties on Filter Bed Road to the Pine Hill Road Development District, and it didn't pass at town meeting. I know that wasn't a stamp, but I would hope that would be taken into consideration. It sounds like a good idea. You get the traffic off of Bay Street, you put some on Filter Bed Road, but what do you do about Abenaki Trail treatment? People that need to walk downtown. You want people to walk downtown. We're all walking on that street, and as I said, there's a lot. So those are our main concerns. Please be very careful, especially about that throughway to 109. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Judy Crosley, and I would echo thanks for all the hard work. It's an amazing document that you've put together. I would like to just address, I'm looking up here, water quality, housing, economic development, redevelopment, and gateway enhancement, all of which we talked about a couple of years ago when we talked about zoning on 28 going north from Pickering Corner, but specifically 28 north of Mass Landing to 109. And you may remember that we worked hard to change the zoning there to protect the watershed. And every time we come in here to talk about rezoning, we talk again about developing that area. And it's always about broadening to develop it. I just would like to remind everybody on this board that that area specifically from Mass Landing to 109 borders entirely on Crescent Lake and Lake Wentworth. Nobody realizes that because you can't see it, except for a very brief area. But it all borders, it's all watershed for Crescent Lake and Lake Wentworth. And if one of our primary issues is watershed to our lakes, it's really important that we think about that. And 28 going south from Pickering Corner borders to a great deal on Russ Pond. So just keep that in mind. Thanks.
Thank you. Basically, the redevelopment we had talked about was actually in the greater downtown area, which was Bay Street, Wolfeboro Falls Limited District, and Central Business District. So I wanted to put that out there. Okay.
Suzanne Ryan. There is a common thread that I've seen through these chapters, and they reference, as you have said, mixed uses, primarily targeted for downtown and the expanded area, which isn't really clarified. But when you get to this chapter here, future land use under community character, on page 178, number 6, you'll finally see the word come out, form-based code. And that's one that I have trouble with. I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, but I think you need, that was my big takeaway from this project. And I think that it needs to be further explained now rather than later as to what that term means, how it's implemented, and how it's administered. Is it going to be, when these uses are allowed to be mixed, is it going to be through an ordinance? Is it going to be through a special exception? I would like you to elaborate more on this mixed use and infill in downtown as well. Thank you.
Form-based, we haven't decided if we're going to be doing that or not. It was a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, it's simply a suggestion at this time.
So that hasn't been discussed with the planning board. The infill that we were talking about was adding to the central business district in some areas that would have more development.
Yeah, and just for the public's purposes, form-based code is a type of, frankly, land use regulation that focuses more on the aesthetic of development rather than the uses that are taking place within. You see this traditionally in downtown areas, some more urban environments. The goal is to get a certain aesthetic in a certain area while not overly restricting what takes place within the buildings that are developed. And I think that it's something that's been implemented in some smaller communities in the state of New Hampshire. It's implemented via a regulating plan that the planning board would review. There'd be a significant public hearing process, but Suzanne, it's something we haven't looked at in detail, so I hesitate to say whether it be special exception, permitted use. I don't have an answer to that question just yet. Sorry.
And it hasn't been discussed with the planning board.
It hasn't been discussed with the planning board at all, so I hesitate to make any comments about how it may proceed, but it is a zoning that's generally focused on aesthetic and less on use.
Okay, anyone else for future land use? Then I'll close the public hearing on that chapter and open a public hearing on any additional comments that people want to make or suggestions that may not fit in specifically in a chapter. Does anyone have any additional comments? Okay.
I think
no, because we're going to be closing the public hearing.
I think that depends on whether the planning board closes the public hearing tonight.
Okay, well, does anyone want to make any comments, general comments? Okay.
My name is Mark Whitehead, summer resident. I think it's wonderful what you're doing. My name is Mark Whitehead. I'm a summer resident, and I think it's wonderful what you're doing on all the planning. One of the things that I think, however, you might want to address at some point, small community in New England, is the impact of global warming. I've not heard much comment about that in your plan here, but there's two choices that society faces going forward. One is that we don't do anything about it, in which case you're going to have major weather issues, perhaps migration issues, a lot of things that might affect a small community. If we do something about it, then people's standard of living are going to be dramatically affected, and I don't know how that affects a small community. I don't have any answers to that. It's just occurred to me as I listened to you that you might want to set up a committee going forward just to think about what people are saying about the impact of global warming in New England and on small communities. Whichever way we end up going on this, I think unfortunately, we're vulnerable as a small, wonderful community. Might want to think about that.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
I would support the person that's sitting behind me. I didn't turn around for a second meeting, giving the public an opportunity to go online, to read the whole report, and then to come in with very specific questions.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to address the issue of solar and renewable energy. It's very much on our minds in the Energy Committee, and we certainly are going to be working very closely with the town as the Energy Committee to be sure that renewable energy is very much a part of our energy mix going forward, and do all we can to really encourage and support it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, planning board members, would you like to continue this until the next meeting, the public hearing, which would be September?
I've recommended two potential dates. The regular work session date would be the 17th, or if you'd like to just continue this to the next meeting, you can certainly do that.
Is September 10th.
Okay, yes, yeah, you could absolutely do that.
I would ask the board to continue to September 17 to give us a meeting in between now and the consideration of readoption, so that we have a chance to thrash out some of the issues that we have heard here.
Well, we're talking about continuing the public hearing.
Yes, understood. Continue the public hearing on the 17th, correct? On the 10th.
Well, I was thinking that if we did it the 10th, then we could take the additional comments and then have a discussion on the 17th. But however the board wants to proceed.
I'm sorry, maybe I make myself clearer. If we have a chance on the September 10th to thrash out what we heard and then come back to the public on the 17th, second public hearing, with the results of what we have discussed, that would be perfectly fine with me.
Okay. Okay, so we'll continue. Is everybody okay with that? Continuing the public hearing until the 17th? Okay.
So moved. At 7 p.m. here in the Great Hall.
7 o'clock, 17th, in the Great Hall. Okay, and we will probably be discussing this on the
September 10th agenda.
But that's after public hearings.
Correct.
At the end of the agenda.
Correct.
Second that.
Okay, thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So is everybody clear? Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming.